When Hitler heard about the attack the Japanese did on Pearl Harbor, he was delighted because he thought that he had an ally that couldn't be defeated. Thus, he would quickly declare war on the United States after they declared war on Japan. During this time, things were looking bad for the Allied powers because the Axis powers were quickly destroying ships sent by them, and they seemed to be invincible. During this time, things were looking bad for the Soviet Union because German armies were closing in major cities like Moscow and Leningrad. The Soviets would try their best to resist by burning crops, destroying farm equipment, and other things, so that in case they were captured, the Germans could use any of their equipment. However, doing this caused a lot of bad because approximately 1 million Russians died because of starvation. After the bombing on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces would move over the Pacific and would gain control over Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And American troops led by General MacArthur had to defend a huge area with very little soldiers. This area was known as the Philippines. MacArthur and his soldiers fought bravely against all odds. However, they would be outnumbered and forced to retreat. However, without MacArthur vowing to return, and with this defeat, the Japanese would move forward, capturing Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch Indies. Japan would also threaten India and the western side of Australia and New Zealand. As more and more victories came for the Axis powers, the Allied powers would make a strategy to first defeat Italy and Germany, and then combine their forces to defeat Japan. There were air carriers that survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. They decided that they would be used to attack Japanese forces, and on May 1942, a Japanese fleet would attack the Coral Sea near where Java was. After a 3-day fight, the Japanese fleet would leave, and a month after, the American Navy would win the Battle of Midway. They won by sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and attacking Japanese offense. In October 1942, the British would be victorious in Egypt, led by Erwin Rommel. While this was happening, American troops led by commanders Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George S. Patton would land in Morocco and Algeria and push Germany troops east. The Allied powers would then get bases from North Africa and plan a surprise invasion on Italy. And on September 1943, the Allies would cross into Italy's mainland. By this time, Benito Mussolini had been overthrown. However, Italy was occupied by Germany, and then Allied powers would push their way up to the peninsula of Italy. The Soviet army would repel Germans from Leningrad, and after months of fighting, Soviet soldiers would force the German army to surrender. On June 4th, 1944, Allied powers would free Rome from Nazi control, and as the Soviet Union won fights, it would mean that they were slowly losing soldiers, and Stalin would urge Britain and the United States to send soldiers to France. After some months of planning, they came up with Operation Overlord. General Eisenhower would be leading this attack, and with them he had about 3 million soldiers ready to fight. And on June 6th, 1944, also known as D-Day, would begin. Allied forces would push into France, even though German forces shot and fired at them. And on August 25th, 1944, Allied forces would reach Paris, freeing France from Nazi control. By September, the Allies would move towards Germany, and on December 16, 1944, Germany would make a counterattack during the Battle of the Bulge. This battle slowed the Allied powers, but they didn't stop, and they kept on bombing cities, destroying a lot of factories, and lowering Germany's supplies. By mid-1944, President Roosevelt would go for a 4th term and winning with about 54% of the votes. And on April 1945, while Roosevelt was on vacation, he complained about a headache, and a few hours later, he would die. This would mean that Roosevelt's competitor would become the new president. His name was Harry S. Truman. By April 1945, American troops were closing in on Germany in the west, while the Soviets attacked from the east, and as Allied forces attacked Berlin, Hitler would hide underground and commit suicide. A week later, on May 7th, 1945, Germany would surrender. As Allied forces swept into Europe, they would fight the Japanese in the island of Suippes, and as they fought the Japanese, they would be greatly outnumbered since they had about 32,000 troops compared to the USA, who had about 100,000 troops. While the war continued, the main goals for the US was to invade Japan and regain the Philippines to finally win the war. Allied forces would then strategize to island hop and slowly defeat the Japanese forces, and on October 1944, General MacArthur would return for another fight for the Philippines, and he would be successful in capturing 2 islands. Then, in July 1945, while Truman, Churchill, and Stalin were in a meeting at Potsdam, Germany, Truman received the word that American scientists had created a new weapon. This weapon was known as the atomic bomb. They described that the bomb had the power to destroy a whole city. However, some scientists said that it was too dangerous to use. Then, in that moment, the Allied leaders sent a message to Japan saying that if they didn't surrender, they would unleash this deadly weapon. However, Japanese leaders would ignore this warning, and on August 6, 1945, the United States would drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, killing about 70,000 residents. And on August 9th, 1945, they would drop another bomb on Nagasaki, Japan, killing another 40,000 residents. And finally, on August 14, 1945, the Emperor of Japan would surrender, thus declaring the end of World War II.